The Roaring Twenties were a time brimming with new discoveries of promiscuity and rebellion through music, dance, dress, and the illegal consumption of alcohol. Parties raged and booze flowed faster than ever. It was a turning point for American culture. One of the most important hallmarks of this historical age was the jazz movement. Jazz was the pinnacle of entertainment in many speakeasies during the 1920s. Both the culture of speakeasies and the influence of jazz fueled rebellious and scandalous behavior, increasing the demand for alcohol. The Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who heavily advocated for the illegalization of alcohol, resolved their conflict over initiating prohibition with the passing of the 18th Amendment. However, a large portion of the public strongly opposed this act. Some Americans thought that the government didn't have the right to interfere so much in their lives and personal choices. In fact, their philosophies were so discordant from the temperance movement ideals that they acted in complete opposition to the law. People would find anywhere to get a drink, if not quietly in their homes, then in secret underground bars called speakeasies, which were more often than not run by gangsters. While speakeasies were not the only way to drink, they were certainly the most popular, iconic, and influential to history. The pinnacle of speakeasy culture was jazz music. You simply could not have a successful club without the hottest new musicians. The start of Prohibition kicked off the Jazz Age. Jazz is a style of improvisational music developed by African Americans with a mixture of European harmonic structures and African rhythms. Its strongest influences, for reference, are ragtime and blues. Because their music was often associated with promiscuity and a loose sense of morals, they were perfect to play in these hot new criminal nightclubs. Another more modern example of music encouraging rebellion is seen in rock and roll, which partly stems from jazz.
Jazz is a music that permeates a lot of different popular styles. In fact, jazz is responsible for maybe even the beginnings of rock and roll, a style that brought back more of the sort of earthy type feel. So we got hard funk and soul. We're definitely derivatives of jazz music. So, especially for rhythm.
The wild and free nature of the music encouraged a sense of disobedience to the patrons of speakeasies, which kept them coming back for more liquor. Some of the most notable and famous musicians of the jazz age were Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five, Duke Ellington and his orchestra, and Bix Beiderbecke. The black musicians who had developed this American-made style of music were in high demand for entertainment in speakeasies. Originally, both audiences and musicians of jazz were all black, but when the music became more popular, many white musicians began to adopt the style. In fact, the first jazz recording ever was recorded by an all-white band. In 1917, the original Dixieland Jazz Band released their first jazz recording titled Livery Stable Blues. People often believed jazz to be the devil's music, which caused a lot of social conflict between listeners and non-listeners. Many, however, compromised and listened to the music when white musicians began playing it. This begs the controversial question of a modern-day cultural conflict. Is this another example of a way that the white majority has appropriated black culture without giving due credit, or is it simply a spreading of ideas becoming popularized?
Called Dixieland, which is pretty much a derogatory could see it as a bit of a derogatory term, Dixie, referring to the South and slavery and things like that, kind of meaning that like the music of this hot music that they danced to came from the South, and was born out of the slave culture.
To further this question, we can look at one of the most popular clubs of the Prohibition era, the Harlem Cotton Club. Run by white mobster Owney Madden, it was decorated to look like a southern plantation. It only allowed white clientele to enter and black musicians to perform. Incidents such as this one make it very clear that the empowerment of black artists was unfortunately met with much of the racial conflict at the time. An entire people, finally freed by their captors, was still perpetually met with segregation and oppression in every facet of life, even the creation of their own music and art. Looking at the opposite side of this conflict, many black artists were highly empowered by the jazz movement and gained a voice through their art form that the public finally listened to. This cultural compromise led to the Harlem Renaissance. This huge movement, powered by black artists driven north by Jim Crow laws in the South, got its name from the city it originated in. In New York, the District of Harlem quite literally made a lot of noise in the 1920s when black music, literature, and other art thrived, with much jazz music in the center of the debacle. This movement spread into other northern cities such as Chicago and Cleveland. The Harlem Renaissance gave them a platform to voice their thoughts and beliefs on a level that Black Americans had never before been able to do. The African American community was not the only demographic that jazz empowered, however. The women's rights movement exploded during the Prohibition. This can be attributed to a combination of many factors of the time, the most important of which are the end of World War I and the beginning of the rebel culture that jazz often promoted. When men returned home from the war, they were able to join the workforce again, and women were no longer needed to work the jobs that the men of the country had left unattended during the war. It became a common goal for women to find personal fulfillment and independence. This new goal of women across America coincided with the popularization of jazz and the rebellion against the Prohibition. This manifested itself into flapper culture. Women began to wear what was considered more boyish silhouettes. Dresses were straighter, looser, and shorter. Their daring makeup consisted of smoky eyeshadow and bright red lipstick. They broke social rule after rule when they began drinking and smoking in public, an unbecoming scene for a lady. They danced promiscuous dances such as the tango and the Charleston. The most blamed catalyst for this female revolution was jazz. It seemed that the music inspired women to abandon their uptight, strict social regimens and loosen up. Flapper culture was highly looked down upon by the older generation, who thought they were too wild and immoral. Women in this time were more aware of their capabilities and value to society than ever, and they wanted others to be aware of it too. All of this rebellion against Prohibition sparked conflict between the public and law enforcement. The police force had the most run-ins with gangsters who often tried to take over large areas with expertly organized crime in order to make money by illegally distributing alcohol. They were often the ones running the speakeasies. Jazz musicians who got jobs in speakeasies developed friendships with the gangsters who ran them, which gave jazz a reputation for being associated with criminal activity. Some believe this enhanced the music's authenticity. Because jazz often promoted rebellious attitudes amongst its listeners, it encouraged the consumption of alcohol, thus promoted gangsters' business. Ultimately, there weren't enough policemen fighting the criminal bootleggers to stop the flow of alcohol, which many believe is why Prohibition failed. Some government officials even bought illegal alcohol themselves or accepted bribes from big-time gangsters to look the other way when their crimes were brought into question. By the late 1920s, America had lost faith in the Prohibition. Alcohol consumption rates were still high, and people disregarded the law casually and constantly. Conflict expressing itself in crime and violence had actually increased because big gang rivalries developed, and bootleggers had become rich off of smuggling alcohol across the country. After a 13-year battle, the government finally compromised with the American people. It was clear that the 18th Amendment was a failure. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was passed, which repealed the 18th Amendment and therefore ended Prohibition. However, the effects of Prohibition on America's musical, artistic, and social culture would never be reversed. Though Prohibition came to a crashing halt, the jazz movement continued to grow.
Therefore, the music becomes more esoteric. It becomes music for musicians, and then not for just the general population. And so then you start to see emergence of innovators in the music, the genius of Miles Davis, of John Coltrane, of Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, obviously. And then the music starts to take on a very artful form.
Swing became the most popular form of the music, giving people lighthearted and mood-lifting relief during the economic conflict of the Great Depression, serving as an emotional compromise for the people most afflicted by the economic downturn. Today, jazz is still popular in not only clubs, but is classically studied. It remains one of the many facets of great American art.